Athletes embodied the American ideal in the post-war age. Clean cut, hard-working, and white. But over the next quarter century, that ideal changed, and with it, college football. Despite decades of conflict, the game, over time, welcomed African Americans onto its field. A week after Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, commander of the military forces in the West, ordered California's governor to cancel the 28th Rose Bowl. He was worried about congested highways and the 100,000-seat stadium serving as potential targets. DeWitt's commands were heeded everywhere but in Corvallis, Oregon. The Oregon State Beavers had completed their most successful season to date and were bound for Pasadena to face Wallace Wade's Duke Blue Devils in the Rose Bowl. Percy Losey, the athletic director at Oregon State, thought that playing the game would be good for morale and drove down the coast to meet with the general. At Bayonet Point, Losey was told that there would be no Rose Bowl game, and DeWitt threatened to call the troops out if necessary.
During the war, it was blackouts all up and down the West Coast. People couldn't leave the lights on in their house because there was this fear of Japanese submarines, which were out there.
Without much hope of playing in Pasadena, Losey called Wallace Wade to talk about alternatives. Wade, who was no fan of the West Coast, having lost his last Rose Bowl to USC, told Losey that they should play the Rose Bowl, but in Durham, North Carolina. Duke was heavily favored in the game, but a motivated Oregon State squad came east and won the historic contest 20-16. It would be the only time the game was played outside of Pasadena, and the only Rose Bowl Oregon State ever won. With another world war, American life was uprooted. The country's focus was now on the battle around the globe. However, Roosevelt insisted that sports, like college football, continue. As in World War I, campuses were depleted of military-aged men. At the same time, the military set up training programs where many of the nation's best athletes, both officers and recruits, prepared to go to war and played football.
Army would load up with all these college football players, you know, who had used up their eligibility at other schools, but because they were now, quote, in the military, they could play for West Point. So that's where you got Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside.
Mr. Inside was Doc Blanchard, Mr. Outside, Glenn Davis. And between them, opponents were devastated. For 2 seasons during the war, Army didn't lose a game.
It creates incredible inequities. You'd have a school like Nebraska playing with 18-year-old freshmen, for the most part, who hadn't been drafted yet.
They were depleted of talent because most college football players were often, you know, fighting Japan or fighting the Fuhrer.
Besides the dynasty that was created at West Point, American college-age men recruited for war were training at military bases. They formed teams and played football against colleges. Stacked with talent, military training teams like Iowa Pre-Flight and Great Lakes Naval Station found themselves near the top of the polls. The Japanese surrendered on August 14, 1945. The soldiers came home, and again, college football would adjust. It boomed. GI Bill made it possible for thousands of war veterans to attend American universities and their football games. As the 1940s moved to a close, however, there remained a critical issue yet to be resolved: African Americans' place in the modern world of college football. Before Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier in 1947, he was a star at UCLA. Robinson excelled at track, baseball, basketball, and of course, on the football field as a breakaway halfback.
We were having a conditioning drill. They called it Wolf Over the River. One player would be the wolf, and everybody else on the team would line up on the goal line. Then the object was to go from the goal line to the 50-yard line without having a wolf touch you. Would you believe everybody were wolves and Jackie would get through the whole damn team and nobody could touch him?
Robinson, the most famous African-American pioneer in sports, continued the legacy of limited black participation in college football dating from before the turn of the 20th century. Black players broke into the game in northern school. One of the earliest pioneers was Harvard's William Henry Lewis, an All-American in 1892 and 1893.
He was like many of the other African-American athletes in predominantly white university sport at that time, in that he came from an upper middle class family, somebody who would go on to an outstanding post-college career, becoming an assistant attorney general under President Taft's administration in 1911.
The early part of the 20th century, with the rise in prominence of the Ku Klux Klan and the release of D.W. Griffith's monumental yet racist film, Birth of a Nation, was a particularly dark time in American history. But in this climate, two black players rose above the repression and the adversity, becoming two of the best players of their day. In 1950, Fritz Pollard was on his way to Dartmouth, where one of his older brothers played football, when he got off the train at Providence and visited Brown University. He never got back on the train to Dartmouth. At the time Pollard enrolled, approximately 600 students attended Brown. He was one of two black students. Pollard was ostracized by teammates. They gave him an oversized uniform, making him appear clown-like. His presence would clear out the shouters.
The football practice field was about 1.5 miles from the campus, so you had to take a little trolley car from the field back to the campus, and when he got on the trolley car to go back to the campus, everybody else got off. And Pollard was a tough guy. He had to be as tough to do as much as he did. He said tears came to his eyes.
For Pollard, games were brutal. He was constantly subjected to racial taunts from the opposition, their crowds, and their communities.
The word he used, that he was niggerized at both Harvard and Yale. They called him all kinds of things, and particularly at Yale, the constant singing of Bye Bye Blackbird, which was directed at Pollard. He couldn't enter the stadium with his team. The team went in first, and then Pollard came darting out just as the kickoff for fear that there was going to be a riot.
In 1916, Pollard made Brown into a national power and led them to a berth in the Tournament of Roses game. Fritz Pollard became the first black player to play in a bowl game.
He faced a lot of discrimination in terms of the hotels. On the Pullman car, he wouldn't serve meals unless his teammates who would finally come over to his side raised a ruckus to get him. But moving anywhere or eating anywhere or staying anywhere for a black man in the white society was just as difficult.
The same year Pollard stepped onto the gridiron in Providence. In New Jersey, another black player had ambitions of a college football career. He would become not only a great college player, but one of the 20th century's most important figures. Paul Robeson was the son and grandson of slaves. A dominant athlete in high school, Robeson chose to attend Rutgers. An imposing figure on the football field. He was 6'3", 220 pounds. If the mite-sized Pollard relied on speed, then Robeson relied on his strength and agility.
Came out for the team at the beginning of the term and was beaten up so badly he was thought about quitting. But his older brother, Ben, convinced him that since he had the physical and mental toughness to do it, he owed it to the race to at least give it a shot.
Stretching out after a play, Robeson was lying on his face when a teammate purposely stomped on his hand. He waited until the next play to get his revenge.
He sort of concentrated his rage and focused it as if he was doing this for his entire people, not just personal. So he exploded this energy, knocked these two guys aside, and tackled the back, but in sort of one motion, put him up above his head as if he was going to break his back across his thighs. He pretended to do that, but so well that everybody believed he might do it. So the coach yelled, "Oh, you're on the varsity." And so Dad just dropped the guy and walked off holding his hand, and that's how he made the team.
Robeson would make Walter Camp's All-American team. Using his size and speed to his advantage, he was dominant as both an end on offense and a linebacker on defense. In a game against a college all-star team in 1970, stocked with All-Americans, Robeson single-handedly led his team to victory, scoring both touchdowns in a 14-0 victory and terrorizing them on defense.
That made him a nationwide legend. Just making the team as a freshman made him a hero. By the time he was an All-American, he was a hero to African Americans nationwide.
The press reported him as a mild-mannered man, yet anger was raging inside of him, but he learned how to diffuse it with humor, or with excellence, or with just plain arrogance. You have to believe in yourself, but if you don't believe in yourself, you're not going to make it.
Pollard and Robeson both played professional football together. Fritz Pollard became the first black inductee into the Football Hall of Fame. Paul Robeson would achieve much greater fame than his exploits on the football field as a singer, orator, actor, and civil rights activist. In the 1920s, Red Grange was running all over the opposition and the headlines in white America. In the black South, it was Ben Stevenson. A 7-year All-American, Stevenson's teams won 69 games and lost once. Stevenson at Tuskegee put black college football on the map. The game became vital to the African-American communities across the nation.
A lot of historically black colleges began in some of the most obscure and trying situations. I know one college started in an abandoned railroad boxcar with only a handful of students.
A black college football world developed that was virtually a mirror image of the mainstream football world. The pageantry of college football was replicated at the black colleges. You know, they had their own bands, they had their own cheerleaders, they had their own heroes.
It gave them a symbol of possibility. I think it gave them a sense of racial pride.
With only a sprinkling of players across the North, and as segregation hardened in the South in the middle of the 20th century, the game of black college football became more important and continued to get stronger.
It didn't change at all in the 40s and 50s. If you were a black high school football player and you wanted to go to college in the South, you went to a black college. I mean, there was no question about that. There was no option about that.
With talent pouring in, black colleges began to draw the attention of not only their own communities, but that of mainstream white America as well. No school had as great an impact as Grambling State University.
If you talk about black college football, you cannot help but talk about Grambling. Grambling was the entree to black college football for a lot of people outside the black college community, for a lot of people outside the black community.
In 1941, a 22-year-old feed mill employee from Baton Rouge applied for a football coaching position at the Louisiana Negro Normal Institute. The young man was Eddie Robinson, and the school would become known as Grambling. His 57-year career included 9 black national championships on his way to becoming the winningest coach in college football history. In the process, Coach Rob, as he was affectionately known, along with the school's public relations director, Collie Nicholson, put the Grambling football program on white America's map. And like Notre Dame in the 1920s, Grambling proved that publicity could be the most potent weapon in any football program's arsenal.
Collie was a great writer. He wrote about the boys, and he helped a lot of them get a lot of recognition.
Many of the great coaches in black college football built their programs with poor facilities and little funding. At Florida A&M, Papa Rattler, Jake Gaither, shook the football world. He won 84% of his games in 36 years at the school. He was one of the great motivators and innovators of the sport. The son of a preacher, Gaither knew how to orate. Coaches, both black and white, attended his coaching clinics, held annually in Tallahassee. He was revered by his peers and his players.
Florida A&M one year had 7 players who were world-class sprinters, including Bob Hayes. Hayes went to the 1964 Olympics, and Bob's getting a lot of press. Bob comes back to join the football team, and a lot of his teammates were jealous about it. Coach Gaither called a team meeting one day and he said, I understand that a lot of you guys have a lot of problem with the publicity that Bob is getting. And he said, I tell you what you do? The player said, what? He said, outrun him.
For Gaither and many in black college football, segregation meant exclusion, not only in day-to-day life, but in the game of football itself. Going to a black college meant an end to a playing career. Most players went back to their hometowns, perhaps to coach or to move on to another field. In 1949, a Grambling running back, a 20-year-old nicknamed Tank by Grambling's Collie Nicholson, changed that reality. The Los Angeles Rams made Paul Tank Younger the first player from a black college program in the National Football League.
If you're going to talk about a pioneer, Tank Younger is a pioneer with a capital P.
I'm sitting down in Eddie's office and we're talking about this great opportunity. And he said, you don't realize, Tank, how important it is that you make it. They bring you up there, and if you don't make it, they can always say, well, we took your best, and he wasn't good enough. And he says, no telling when another football player from black college will get another opportunity.
When he left, I carried him to the train, and the guy looked at him, he said, hey, Tank, you think you're gonna make it? He said, if they playing football, I'm gonna make it.
If Tank Younger had not made the Rams team that year, it would have set black college football back another 5 or 10 years because he was far and away the best player in black college football at the time.
Black college football programs down south were instrumental in sending some of the most talented players in the country to the professional ranks. Eddie Robinson alone sent over 200 players to the NFL. NFL and AFL scouts scoured the rural backwaters of the Deep South, looking for talent, and were not disappointed.
You would watch an American Football League game, and they said, and there's Willie Lanier from tiny Morgan State. You know, they were always tiny this and tiny that. And of course, there were tiny schools, but there were schools that hardly anybody knew where they were.
For 10 years in the 1960s and the 1970s, at least one player from a black college was a first-round pick in the NFL draft. Among them, Walter Payton from Jackson State, Doug Williams from Grambling, Jerry Rice from Mississippi Valley State. But black college football programs produced only 2 more first-round picks after Rice, a sign of the success of integration and its effect on black college football. While black players in the South were restricted to black college football, black players in the North and at a few schools in the West continued to appear on the playing fields. As transportation improved and as teams looked to build reputations, intersectional play grew. The result was usually disastrous for the black athlete.
When we played other colleges, and the farther south you went, the more this happened, they would call you boy, they would call you nigger, get up, Sambo, as you went farther south.
The relationships between Southern institutions and Northern institutions and intersectional football contests, I think, is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of college football. I think it tells you quite a bit about Southern culture and the continued racial forms of discrimination in that part of the country.
If you had contests between an integrated Northern team and a segregated Southern team, the typical arrangement in the 1930s was that the Northern team would agree to hold its black player out of the game out of consideration for the tender sensibilities of their Southern opponents. It was absolutely humiliating to the players that were involved.
One such instance occurred at Michigan in 1934, when the Wolverines agreed not to play its speedy star, Willis Ward, in a game against Georgia Tech at Ann Arbor. Athletic director Fielding Yost, worried about protest on campus, hired Pinkerton police as security. Ward missed the game while his teammates beat the Yellow Jackets 9-2. Racism would rear its ugly head in several incidents on the field as well. In 1950, Drake's Johnny Bright led the nation in total offense and was leading again in 1951 when Drake was slated to face Oklahoma A&M.
Some of John's teammates were told that John Bright would not be around to finish the game. One of John's friends who was on the track team warned him to be careful when going to Stillwater for this game.
A photographer from the Des Moines Register was on hand at the game, and what he captured would shock the football world. Minutes into the game, Johnny Bright handed the ball off. A&M's Will Banks Smith broke Johnny Bright's jaw.
The photographic evidence was so absolutely unambiguously telling. Photos were picked up all over the country. This became a racial incident that couldn't be ignored.
Bright was nearly knocked out, but stayed in the game, and on the next play, threw a 60-yard touchdown pass.
61 yards for a touchdown.
He remained in the game and eventually succumbed to A&M's relentless defenders. With his jaw wired shut, Bright's season was over, but the controversy had just begun. The evidence was overwhelmingly against the Aggies and drew a belated apology. But when officials refused to discipline Oklahoma A&M, Drake withdrew from the conference.
I believe that it created a certain empathy and sympathy to the plight of black athletes at predominantly white institutions.
Less than 2 years after the landmark Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education integrated America's schools, a college football game, the 1956 Sugar Bowl, became a battleground in the old Confederacy.
The last stand of segregation in the South. This is the major civil rights event in the history of college football.
Bobby Greer was the only black player on Pitt's football team in 1955. It was a great year for Pitt, earning an invitation to the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans. Georgia Tech, with national title hopes, was also invited to play in the game.
A segregationist Governor Marvin Griffin had initially notified Bobby Dodd, the Georgia Tech coach, that he would have no objection to this. But when Greer's presence became publicized, Griffin suddenly realized that this was an occasion to publicize the white South's resistance to segregation.
Well, back then he says, well, why are they doing this? We played teams, Southern teams that come up north and played, and we had no problems. But I'm just sorry it happened. I just wanted to play football. First chance to ever play in a bowl.
Governor Griffin telegraphed the Georgia Board of Regents, "The South stands at Armageddon." The battle is joined. We cannot make the slightest concession to the enemy in this dark and lamentable hour of struggle.
A strange thing happened. That is that the students became incensed that their team would not be in the final rankings if they did not play. Well, they wanted them to go to the Sugar Bowl. And darn it, Marvin Griffin wasn't going to stand in their way.
For the most part, Southern columnists simply wanted the incident to go away. They objected that Marvin Griffin had stirred things up unnecessarily. And this is at a time when the Montgomery bus boycotts are going on and the South is really rising up against segregation. And this was an incident that threw all of that into the world of sports in a way like no other incident before.
Georgia Tech students converged on the governor's mansion, overturned cars, and hanged Marvin Griffin in effigy. State police were called to put down the riot. Underestimating the power of a sporting event, Griffin had no other choice. He backed down. The game itself was a tightly fought struggle. It remained a scoreless tie until late in the game. Bobby Greer was covering an incomplete pass.
And I covered a gentleman's named Ellis. Now I was covering him all the way down the field, and next thing I know, I got pushed in the back, and I'm on the ground and looking up, and the ball's going over his head. And I was called for pass interference.
It was a real phantom call. He had touched the guy earlier. He was not even near him whenever and the pass was uncatchable. And it put the ball right there at the goal line for Georgia Tech, and they scored on the next play, and they won the game 7-0.
It was a bad call. You hate to second guess, but I think it had a little bit to do with the controversy.
That the 1956 Sugar Bowl was played at all was a turning point, a step towards transcending racism in the world of college football.
Like I tell people, I'm probably one of the few blacks that ever had a whole group of whites riot for. This changed people's mind, I think, quite a few. I got quite a few letters from down south expressing their dismay at what he had done and tried to do.
The following year, Syracuse accepted a bid to play in the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. In the backfield for the Orangemen was Jim Brown, coming off a record-setting 43-point performance in the season finale against Colgate. Playing against all-white TCU and in front of a segregated crowd, Brown scored 21 points. His missed extra point was the difference in the game as TCU won 28-27. In 2 consecutive seasons, 2 African-American players garnered the spotlight in the Southern Bowl. Mass integration was near, and Southern schools faced crucial decisions. Barred from playing at white schools in the South, black players migrated north in the 1960s. Willie Ray Smith, a coach in Beaumont, Texas, helped begin a pipeline, sending talented players to schools like Michigan State and Minnesota in the Big Ten. Among them, his son, Bubba.
I was 18 years old and at Michigan State before I'd ever talked to a white person. And I wanted to meet everybody on campus. And they threw a little wrinkle in there. They said, he's Jewish. And I said, how do you know? You look white to me. And I ended up joining the Jewish fraternity, you know, just to see who these people were.
You look at the success at Michigan State and many of those other schools is when the Southern black would come up because they didn't have the opportunity to play in the South.
Some of those great coaches were able to go down south and get some of the better black athletes out of the South. I think it changed the game of college football. I think it realized if you're going to compete with those players, you better also recruit the same kind of athlete.
The Southwest and South resisted. Integration moved at a glacial pace. Jim Crow ruled and melted away slowly.
Now, looking back, my God, how? Why? You can trace it back historically to the Civil War and slavery. But when you look at another human being's eye, and you've grown up with that person, playing Cowboys and playing football. Why, from a human standpoint, why was it perpetuated for so long?
First, teams in the Southwest began to change. In the mid-1950s, Oklahoma head coach Bud Wilkinson turned to a local high school player to tear down Oklahoma's color line.
Prentice Scott is 14 years old, and he loves Bud Wilkinson, but he knows he can't depend on being able to play at Oklahoma because he's black. One afternoon, Prentice and two of his teenage buddies get on a bus and go to the stadium. And they think it's going to be barbed wire fence and they can't get in. Well, they just climb this wall and there's nobody there. It's summer. And they run around the field for an hour. They leave and they're on their way back to the bus, and this white guy stops them and says, you know, you got to be out of here before dark. I mean, we just don't allow colored people in Norman after dark. And so they take off, and Prentice says, yes, sir, we're on our way to the bus. And he stops and he turns to this man and he said, sir, if it's all the same to you, I plan to be back. And by God, he was.
In 1956, Prentice Galt became the first black scholarship football player in the southern part of the United States. Both player and coach took considerable heat. It was not uncommon for Galt, while walking through campus, to be asked to shine shoes.
I think Prentice Scott will tell you that it was one of the hardest things he ever went through. In fact, he got his doctorate in psychology because he wanted to study himself and find out about this sadness that had come out of this experience.
Initially, there was a distancing. Guys on that team needed to see me play. They needed to see what kind of heart I had. You do feel a little bit like you're going through it alone. I was saying to myself, when I was going through it, nobody else is experiencing this. There were days that you were really down, and yet you had to build yourself up to get out there just to practice, tossing your cookies and saying, yeah, I got to stay, I'm going to stay.
In Galt's 3-year career, the Sooners would lose only 5 games. Integrating Oklahoma was a success, but it was perhaps the hardest victory of Prentice Galt's career.
Prentice Scott said one of the most touching things I've ever seen. It was during Bud Wilkinson's testimonial right before he died. He said, Bud, you went through this tough period, you got the hate mail, you really had to ride out the storm, but I want to thank you because you opened the door for everybody else. The Prentice Scott era at Oklahoma was one of the biggest things in integration in the history of sports.
The SMU Mustangs won back-to-back Southwest Conference titles in 1947 and 1948. In the first 2 seasons of the 1960s, the team went 2-20. The once proud football program turned to a young assistant coach from Arkansas, Hayden Fry, to lead the Mustangs back to prominence. At the time, the Southwest Conference, one of the most powerful in the nation, was totally segregated. In Fry's first 3 years, his squads won only 7 games. It was time for a change, one that would also shake the foundation of Southern football.
The SMU administration, they were behind him when he said that this is what he was going to do. But, of course, there was a lot of alumni and football fans who flat did not want it to happen.
Hayden Fry had an eye on an African-American player from Beaumont, Texas. The coach visited his family, discussed the intricacies of Southern cooking with his mother and grandmother, and spoke about the importance of getting an education. Nothing was mentioned about being the first African-American to play in the Southwest Conference. But Jerry Levias learned quickly about the changes in his life once he accepted his scholarship and moved to the Dallas campus.
Hayden said, let's give it a shot. This is the best guy we could get in here that can probably hold his head up and not be affected by going to an all-white rich school.
Young man asked a question in class. Is it true that blacks' brains are smaller than that of whites? And the professor called time out in the class and said, I will address your question, sir. She said that I would take Mr. Levias's child. I would give him the run of the world, let him have all the freedom that he wants, and I would take your child and I'll put him in the closet and only give him bread and water or a few things to eat. Now, which one would be more advanced? And then she continued on to the class.
Coach Fry shielded Levias from the inundation of hate mail, phone calls, and death threats that Levias received in 1966, in his first year at SMU.
We always went on quick snaps for if there was a sniper in the stands, he couldn't get a good shot at me. And if you would count the number of players in the huddle, you would only count 10 because I was in the middle of it.
On the field, Levias took aim at his detractors with speed and agility, blazing past Southwest opponents.
Nobody could keep up with him. And to watch him put a dart and a juke on another player as he ran past him, people in the stands loved it. You know, they had not seen this before. People talked about, you know, all the next week or the weeks to come, you know, they had seen Jerry Levias play.
They accepted me as a football player. They did not accept me as a human being. We got along real well doing football games and football practice, but after that, everyone else went their own way. It was just like a skunk being in the middle of a bunch of people after the game was over with. I'm the only one left, and said, where's everybody going?
Despite the seemingly insurmountable distractions, Levias's on-field play was spectacular, if not miraculous. He led the Mustangs to the Cotton Bowl in his sophomore year. The first black player in the Southwest would make the all-conference team 3 straight years. But it came against a backdrop of bitter resistance and unabashed racism, focused towards a 5'10" young man, 20 years of age.
I had a chance to meet Dr. Martin Luther King, and he said, kindness kills. Just rely on your faith, and everything will take care of itself. And that's what I tried to build my platform on.
When he had a lot of success, the white man in Dallas could relate to that success and began to maybe set aside, if just for a little bit, some of his prejudices.
They say all men are created equal, but after that, it is up to you.
Once the racial barriers in the Southwest Conference fell, only one major conference held out. The Southeastern comprised mostly of schools in the Deep South. If true change was going to come to the Deep South on the football field, then it needed a leader, someone to end the century-old oppression. That someone would be an Alabama graduate himself, a coach who was destined to become a legend. As head coach of Alabama in the 1960s, Paul Bryant knew he would have to integrate to win national championships.
It seemed he went to a bowl every year, and he usually won. My late colleague Jim Murray used to say, yeah, Alabama's a champion of the white leagues. Now you look at Alabama and South Carolina and Mississippi, and you see lineups, you know, heavily black. And in a way, Bear Bryant, for all the criticism with his all-white teams, he was the leader of this change.
Bryant said, enough of this. We don't need to be segregated on the football field. We can be integrated on the football field. When a man of his stature said, let's do it, then it was done, and I think it helped the walls fall.
By the late 1960s, the northernmost schools in the SEC integrated, and Bryant felt it was time for the first black player to don an Alabama uniform. The only challenge was he had to convince his team, its fans, and the school administration that Alabama was ready. In 1970, Bryant needed an opponent. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, USC head coach John McKay, a coach who had successfully incorporated black players into his winning program, asked Craig Fertig, his 22-year-old assistant coach, for a lift in his car one day.
So I turn here, turn there. Finally, we get to the airport. So I finally said, short term, long term. He says, short term. So I figured, well, short flight. So I'll never forget, 10 o'clock in the morning, we go to the Horizon Room of Western Airlines. He says, we'll have a cocktail here. So he still's not talking to me. And he looks at his watch and he says, we'll have another one here. And he said, well, he'll be here in about 5 minutes. Well, I don't know who he is. In he walks with his houndstooth hat on. Hi, Paul. Hi, John. What'd you want to see me about, Paul? Well, John, we'll have one more here. John, I'm going to offer you $150,000 if you'll come down to play us in Birmingham next year to open up the season.
The meeting was short. The significance was monumental. USC traveled across country, perhaps across time as well, into white Alabama. Clarence Davis, a Birmingham native, scored twice for the Trojans. USC's other back, Sam Cunningham, shocked Alabama with 212 yards and 3 touchdowns. Southern Cal won 42-21. The result was stunning, and exactly what Bear Bryant hoped for. 2 black players in front of an all-white crowd against an all-white team ended segregation on the football field once and for all.
I was expecting Coach Bryant to be really upset, and he says, John, I just want to thank you for what you've done for me and the University of Alabama.
People were going crazy, and Sam scored 4 touchdowns and such, and so after the game, Paul came in and says, can I borrow Cunningham?
And he took Sam Cunningham and asked him to come over to the Alabama locker room. And he told the guys in that locker room, he says, guys, this is a football player.
And he says, now, let me tell you this, gentlemen. Martin Luther King was a great man. But Sam Cunningham did more to integrate the South tonight than he did.
Bear Bryant says, hey, we have to start bringing in kids like that if we're going to play football, because that's the way football is going to be. And even the people, you know, the real bigots down there said, well, the Bear says it's true, so it's true.
3 years after that historic game, 1/3 of Alabama's team was black. In 1973, the Crimson Tide won its first national championship since 1964. By the mid-1970s, college football had survived 30 years of crisis before the Deep South ended segregation. The game got better, faster, and more physical. And while the game changed on the field in the 1960s and the 1970s, off the field, it got bigger thanks to television.
Television made fans out of millions of people that couldn't go to college football games. College football was expensive to go to, even back in the old days, but television brought college football to the front.
It really started to grow in the 60s, and it really started to grow when ABC got college football in 1966. And Roone Arledge wrote the famous memo. He said, I don't want to take the game into the living room. I want to take the viewer into the game. What a wonderful way to spend a Saturday afternoon.
Perhaps no sport has undergone such extensive change and evolution as the game of American football. No other game drew such passion, yet underwent such scrutiny. College football survived decades of violence and death, as well as later confrontations with religion and race. A game perpetuated by a Darwinist. It has survived the test of a century of evolution, and for generations added to the beauty of autumn afternoons.